Hi muckers, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're all doing very, very, very well. Okay, for today's video, I'm really excited to jump in. So we are going to be covering basically the rise and fall of the Cancelled podcast with Tana Mongeau and Brooke Schofield. But I have really been wanting to make this video because I think that the Cancelled podcast is basically a phenomenon unlike any other podcast. Normally when a podcast ends, it ends for a big reason or a big specific moment. But with the Cancelled podcast, it was always destined to fail. And ultimately, it kind of at itself, like the concept of it at itself, which I find really interesting and I want to dive into. As you know, we've been making these videos where we kind of like deep dive topics and kind of give our 2 cents on it. And this was one I was going to film in my living room. However, my apartment is really cold today and this is the only room that has heating and the dog's over there lying in the bed. So we are going to be filming it today at my desk. So anyways, yeah, let's dive into it. And I also want to let you know that you have been nominated. Oh my God, congratulations. You have been nominated for the Adam to 500k subscribers challenge. We are getting so close to 500k. I think we're literally less than like 18,000 away right now. Please, if you have not subscribed, I nominate you and every single person who maybe has a YouTube Google account in your household. And also my Patreon is still 30% off using the code YouTubeMucker, and you get immediate access to me reacting to Shane Dawson's movie Not Cool, using the word movie very loosely, me reacting to the Ribby Frankie Devil in My Family documentary, me reacting to Trisha Paytas's Big Broadway Dream, me reacting to Escape the Night season 1, 2, and 3, and we're doing 4 right now, and the new show on Tubi, and also Beast Games Season 1. So let's get into it. We have a lot to cover. And again, I have my beautiful, delicious little coffee here. Getting a coffee machine was the greatest decision I could have ever made. Also, do you like my Mariah shirt? Also, we're going to be completely changing the background for the new year as well. So this is our last month. Happy December, everyone. Let's take it in while we have it. All right, so I'm going to present to you basically my take on everything to do with the Cancelled podcast because I find it very, very, very interesting how things, panned out in the long run. So let me pull up my notes here. So the Cancelled podcast was definitely a moment in time, quite like Frenemies where I don't think that it could have lasted forever. And that is ultimately kind of what happens with these like hot in the moment podcasts. The concept of it was, Tana Mongeau being messy and Brooke Schofield being messy and then both kind of oversharing. And I think oversharing was the thing that made the podcast work, but ultimately what ruined the podcast in the long run as well. They were talking about bad decisions they were making. They were talking about people they were hooking up with. They were talking about friends that they had fights with. And they were like publicly processing every single thing, which as an audience was really exciting to witness. However, for them, ultimately paid a price in the long run, made them a lot of money, but paid them a price in the long run where it was kind of like, you can't keep doing this and simultaneously have your personal life, which is like this interesting, really back and forth. They were talking openly about, drinking alcohol. They were talking about substance abuse. They were talking about clubbing every night of the week. They were talking about hooking up with people. It was betrayals. It was fighting. It was them fighting. It was like your average conversations that you and your friends would be having, but they wouldn't be publicized. They wouldn't be posted about online. And ultimately, towards the end of Cancelled, that's what they pulled back on, which ruined the show. I think as well, the kind of looking back on Cancelled as to how it began and how the middle was and how it ended definitely goes to show, again, like Frenemies, that this show would not have lasted in the long run. And also, it was a quick burning show, even though it lasted for a good couple of years. It was based on, drama. It was based on chaos. And like we saw with Frenemies as well, there's a lot of parallels, by the way, with Frenemies and Cancelled that a lot of people don't pick up on. It is very important to note that whenever a show is built on that like high tension, what's the word I'm looking for here? Chaos, if you will, it will burn out. And when it burns out, there's no coming back from it anyways. So let's get into the origins of Cancelled. But before that, Mother Mucker Claus has an exciting announcement. I'm gonna be honest, you can go ahead and call me Mucker Claus because ho spelled H-O-E, because I have some exciting news. And that exciting news is that my friends at Bellesa and I are literally sending out free vibrators or gift cards for vibrators to every single mucker that signs up for my giveaway down below. Now we have worked with Bellesa for a good couple months now. We love their products. We love the deal. And And I have never worked with a company that have just been so fun to work with, and they've sent me all of their products. And again, just want to remind you that my friends at Bellissa and I are literally sending out free vibrators or gift cards for vibrators to every mucker that signs up down below. Now, you guys have heard of Bellissa. You've heard me talk about them before. I'm sure you've seen a lot of people talk about them, and that is because they are literally the best in the game. Now, they are a bi-woman company that is all about you embracing your sexuality, discovering it, and I just really love working with them. And again, they're really fun to work with. As you know, my favorite thing about working with Bellissa is they actually really care about you enjoying the products, that they have sent me the products to be able to show you them as opposed to just like telling you about them, which I think is really dope. We know it and we love it. We have the Pebble, and we know this diva right here, the Flutter Vibe. And a lot of you guys were commenting about this one down below. All right, I see you. I've been really excited to tell you about this next thing. So as we know, we have the Air Vibe right here, right? We've talked about it. You've said that you love it. It's got a dual situation going on there. There is so much to explore with it. This is the OG. Waterproof, rechargeable, discreet packaging. By the way, that's my favorite thing about the packaging of all of these is just how discreet they are, and also gorge, by the way. But the thing that's really dope about Bellissa is they're always improving their products. So we didn't think the Air Vibe could get any better, but they have now came out with an Air Vibe Pro. And they have sent it to me right here for us to explore. I will never get over this packaging. It is just so major. It's like a full-on experience. I love it. Just out of the box, this is my favorite coloring of any of them. I love this color so much. Now, quite like the Air Vibe, the original, the Air Vibe Pro stays completely true to the original, but has a lot of requested upgrades, which is great that they're listening and constantly improving their products, by the way. Again, it keeps all those original elements that people love about the Air Vibe, but there were requested changes, and they listened, and they've now given us the Air Vibe Pro. And again, the addition of a remote control is very fun. For those who have already gotten their things from Bellissa, you know exactly what I mean, but genuinely, the quality is insane. I think you can kind of see with the texture anyways what I'm talking about. Pretty major. Jesus fucking Christ. Look, wait, hold on. Now, there is improved controls. There is much stronger vibrations. Jesus Christ. And at max level, by the way, is still impressively quiet. It's kind of hard if you're not holding it to get a gauge of how strong this is. But again, with the remote control. Again, thank you, Bellissa, seriously, for hooking the muckers up. And again, Bellissa and I are literally sending out free vibrators or gift cards for vibrators to everyone that signs up to the giveaway down below. And Bellissa, we love ya, and goodbye. All right, let's get into the video. So it's important to note that the origins of the Cancel podcast were actually Tana Mongeau exposing Brooke Schofield. Now, I know a lot of people remember this, but a lot of people don't. So if you do or do not remember, before the podcast even began, obviously, Tana Mongeau was in her storytelling bag, and Tana and Brooke were friends, but they were very, messy on and off friends from what I could gather from them talking about each other in the past. And the story famously goes that Tana was kind of casually seeing this guy, and Brooke was hanging around Tana's house. But Tana had security cameras all around her house because she's talked about stalkers and security problems all before. And on those cameras, she said that she ended up seeing Brooke and the guy being flirty and too flirty. And then it blew into this big story where Tana was exposing Brooke and was hiding behind the name Mindy as Mindy was doing this to her. Now, the narrative on social media, which I believed, was that Brooke was caught almost on camera, fucking this guy. Now, whenever I went back, it really does seem like Brooke was maybe just kissing him or being flirty, and the story was probably exaggerated and blown up by Tana Mongeau, likely thing for her to do. Now, it is alleged that Brooke ended up kissing him, but that there was no hookup. Now, in Tana Mongeau's idea, her being the storytelling queen and the one who, highly dramatizes everything, when she told this story and, used the codename Mindy for Brooke, she talked about this like it was a huge betrayal of your in-person best friend. And Tana Mongeau has been known for her close friendships with her friends. And so people started diving in to who this would be, who betrayed Tana, who was stealing her man, who broke girl code and stuff. And people were thinking it was Tana's friend Ashley, all these different things. And ultimately people, figured out that she was talking about Brooke Schofield. Again, Tana made this story time. She was calling Brooke Mindy to disguise her identity, but ultimately was giving away so much information that it was so easy to clock who she was fucking talking about in the end. Now, Brooke did end up responding to this in the moment, and I think going back and watching Brooke's video is just, like, they're both so unserious. It's unbelievable. Also, Brooke looks incredibly different, no shade. Now, Brooke responded and basically was, saying the situation was harmless. And this basically is such a interesting blueprint for their, careers starting together in the Cancel podcast, that ultimately their first introduction together as a duo to the internet was exposing each other and being involved in drama and shit talking. And I think that ultimately Cancelled work because there was this setting stone. But this same concept of one of them being exposed or one of them calling out the other one is the reason that the podcast would end in the end. Now, as we know, before Tana did the Cancelled podcast, she was doing story times. She would go on other podcasts. She was in the Shane Dawson documentary. She was in a lot of controversy as well. She was doing, makeup lines. She was doing a lot of brand deals and stuff. Like, she was kind of approaching, I feel like this was a very comfortable place for Tana to ultimately end up, which was a podcast, because I think that in the last couple of years, we have, seen people pivot towards doing podcasts because it is the most popular kind of content to consume right now. So everyone kind of builds themselves up to that point. And so Tana had, built herself up to this point of like creating a consistent podcast with Cancelled. Now, it's been alleged as well, one thing that I find really interesting, that Tana called the podcast Cancelled. So whenever you typed up online, Tana Mongeau Cancelled, the podcast would come up instead of her scandals, which is arguably fucking genius. It's a little bit evil, but it's arguably fucking genius. It's like, I feel like there's examples in Hollywood of that as well, which are like a lot more messy as well. But anyways, this podcast made a lot of sense for Tana, specifically being called Cancelled with all of her scandals. And it was just kind of this easy place for her to like sit down, talk shit. And at the start, kind of the origins of the podcast, it was Tana with just like her friends. And it was never like consistent who stayed with her, which is also interesting to note because in the ending of Frenemies, a big drama was when Tana said, when they ended the podcast, she wanted to just delete all of the videos from the channel and bring it back to a vlog channel. And then this was like, oh my God, Tana Mongeau's taking control of the channel. And it wasn't her podcast to begin with. How much involvement does Brooke have? It is important to note that this was first and foremost Tana Mongeau's podcast with her rotation of friends. And, no one really stuck in the long run. She would have her friend Hunter. She would maybe have like Paige or Ashley or something. But, whenever Brooke came on with the history of the Mindy situation, and Brooke was very dry humor, she matched Tana's energy perfectly. And also, I think the reason that Brooke was able to stick was that Brooke was a chronic oversharer like Tana Mongeau was. So none of the friends fit the perfect description for a co-host of the Cancel podcast, if there was one, until Brooke Schofield entered the scene. And the Brooke Schofield we know now is completely different than the Brooke Schofield that was on the podcast in the original days, because she was oversharing, she was messy, and we'll get to it now, but she really has taken a step back to ensure that people don't twist her words or whatever, which again, ended up ruining the podcast. They rebranded the podcast completely to basically be centered around them, the lore of them, the drama they had, and the past betrayal, if you will, with the Mindy situation, and then moving forward, them going on nights out. It's important to note as well that in the origin days of the Cancelled podcast, it was so electric because it almost seemed like a debrief with your friends. Tana Mongeau was still heavily drinking during this time. Brooke Schofield was drinking. They were both openly talking about their drug use, and they were going to nightclubs, and then it looked like they would film the podcast almost on a come down or still hungover. And they've admitted that they have done this, but that was like the perfect mix of they would overshare, they looked rough, they were being messy. And it was exactly what people kind of my age to their age, the 20 to like 30-year-olds really identified with. They were like your messy friends that you would do the things that you wouldn't do. And quite like Frenemies with that back and forth energy, it's entertaining to watch. You know what I mean? They appeared drunk so much, and that was like the messy energy that people loved, which ultimately, whenever they stopped doing that, it did change the dynamic of the podcast, which isn't a bad thing, but it is important to note that the podcast was literally built on them being messy, oversharing, being drunk, being so psychotic, sleeping with all of LA and then talking shit about all of LA. And what we're going to see is by the end of Cancelled, all of those things stopped. Literally all of those things stopped. They also had no problem exposing literally everyone that they would come into contact with, which again was interesting to the audience. And they would also have no problem exposing themselves in the midst of that. And people kind of loved this like open transparency-ness, which ultimately they would pull back on the bigger the podcast would get. They would talk about their exes in detail, and these would be celebrities as well. It was very messy to watch, and that is ultimately what made it work and why this podcast quickly became one of the most watched podcasts in the world. I think it was genuinely up in the top 5 in America at least, but in the world as well, it was huge. Now, with the Cancelled podcast, I think of the big moments, right? And what's crazy about the Cancelled podcast is the biggest moments of the podcast were ultimately what led to the end of the podcast. You know, the height of Cancelled very quickly became the downfall of Cancelled, which again, quite like Frenemies, the biggest moments are ultimately the moments that ruin it. So let's get into it. You know, Cancelled very quickly turned into a podcast of them talking about their own lives, to talking about drama stories that were happening in the world, and then sometimes they would integrate stories of their own life. So when they started focusing more on topics that didn't relate to them, when they would talk about things relating to them, it would be even bigger because the audience were looking forward to it. So notable stories that we have, of course, are the Clinton Kane series, which was probably arguably the biggest moment in the Cancelled podcast. Brooke Schofield was in a situationship, I guess, with Clinton Kane, who was a singer who, long story short, was allegedly lying about everything that was his life, from his like mother dying to like his family life to where he grew up to his accent to everything. And he's a big singer-songwriter who's so popular within young people and has millions of subscribers on Spotify and hundreds of millions of views. Like, he is a mainstream singer celebrity as well, even though I didn't know who he was. And Brooke Schofield was basically, you know, exposing that his entire life was a lie and allegedly a scam. And this blew into one of the biggest stories of, what was that, 2024, I think it was. And then right after that, we have Brooke Schofield and Tana Mongeau fighting with Alyssa Violet, and the public were taking Tana and Brooke's side. They were making story times exposing Alyssa. They were talking about it on the podcast. They were, another example, which wasn't in that same time frame, was Tana Mongeau exposing Cynthia the Wine Woman, which is a horrible story, and Tana is so clearly in the wrong with how she told that. And I ended up meeting Cynthia because I had made a video on it, and she invited me over to her house and basically gave me the same wine experience that Tana got and was like, I'm going to let you make up your mind on who's in the right and who's in the wrong, which is so diva, by the way, and I love her. And Tana was 100% in the wrong in exposing this woman who's just trying to do her job, a wine tasting tour, when Tana thought she could go and just get blackout. That's not what it was. But then Tana retells the story and calls this woman all these different names and is naming her company and all like this. Then that woman's Google reviews gets doxxed, and so it's horrible, horrible, horrible. So ultimately, this attention of them exposing things and starting these hate brigades was ultimately going to flip on them in the long run if they ever fucked up. The power that they had to take other people down, it was the audience that had the power, so the audience could very quickly take them down. It is actually interesting that they never once picked up on it in the moment. Also, them talking about their relationship with Lila Gibney, a very problematic influencer in LA, and always kind of making excuses with Lila, was kind of turning the audience against them in those last couple months of doing the podcast. But I think that whenever the Clinton Kane and Alyssa Violet stuff happened, it happened right after each other, and literally millions of views, trending on YouTube, trending on social media. Everyone was talking about the Cancelled podcast. This was their peak. Now, this is what happens. At the peak of their podcast, this happens when old tweets from Brooke Schofield resurface. And these are incredibly problematic, incredibly hurtful, incredibly disgusting, racist tweets. So these all resurface, right? And genuinely, it was like clockwork. Now, I'm aware that these had probably been going around social media for a while before this, but they went immediately mainstream the second that the Clinton Kane and Alyssa Violet drama started getting too much. Like, we're too much in the sense that, like, Cancelled were almost untouchable. You know, they were taking everyone down because they were also taking down, who else were they taking down? Clinton Kane, Alyssa Violet, and Zach Sang as well. So ultimately, I do believe that maybe there was people involved behind the scenes that made sure that these things at Brooke went viral at this time to kind of take them down. But ultimately, these deserved to be as mainstream as what they were, considering how horrible the things that Brooke Schofield was saying. Now, this was interesting when all of this happened, because not only was Brooke really driving the main force of the Cancel podcast right now, exposing Clinton, exposing Alyssa, exposing Zach Sang, she was the one who was bringing everything to the podcast, and Tana would really react. And also, for the most part, Tana was seen as the more vulgar one, and Brooke was seen as the more kind of like softer, harmless one, because the public knew about Tana's scandals and her racism and her problematic behavior, but Brooke was still relatively a new individual, so we were still getting our opinion of her. You know what I mean? The backlash was rightfully humongous, and I think that people were comparing it to Tana's old racist, behavior resurfacing, but there was a difference here, because I think that, Tana already had this reputation for being known for old posts or problematic ways, whereas Brooke wasn't. So I always wondered why people were so outraged at Brooke's, but then weren't outraged at Tana. Like, they love Tana, but Tana has, said similar racist things. And I think it genuinely is the expectation for Brooke was so high and the expectation for Tana is so low. And I think that juxtapose made it that everyone cared about Brooke, but didn't care about Tana. Because Tana was able to sit down weeks after Brooke got exposed and basically be like, I condone this behavior from Brooke, I whatever. And I'm sitting here being like, well, she's also been incredibly racist online. But I think the expectation people had for Brooke was higher. And even if the expectation was as low as what it was for Tana, arguably what Brooke was saying was 10 times more racist, 10 times more offensive, and 10 times more targeted. And she deserved to be called out for this. Brooke released terrible apology videos as well, and it was almost like whiplash. She was going from exposing these huge names and industries to then a week later, uploading apology videos for racism. It almost was like the whiplash. I've never seen whiplash like it. I've never, ever seen it. The internet was turning on her, rightfully so. The worse her apology videos were, the worse the public would respond. Absolutely warranted. And ultimately, the podcast started changing from this moment on. And I wouldn't even say that it was a gradual change, because when all of this happened with Brooke took a step back from the podcast for maybe a month or two, or maybe a good couple weeks or whatever. And Tana did a podcast where she filmed it with Paige, their friend. Now, this was already a horrible look, because Tana was like almost replacing Brooke in a sense. Now, I understand there's probably contracts and they had to do episodes and stuff like that, but it was a terrible look that it looked like Tana was siding against Brooke, which ultimately you should be siding against your friend who is being racist, but for your branding, forever tarnished the duo look of Cancelled. It now looked like Tana had dropped Brooke. So when they do that episode and Brooke's not a part of it, it was probably the end of Cancelled. Now, ultimately, whenever, Brooke comes back to Cancelled, it was completely different. Now, it's important to note that during this entire time, they are also on tour doing the Cancelled podcast tour. And, I went to it, and I can also note that their dynamics seemed a little bit strained. And the reason for that, as you can imagine as well, is even if nothing had happened, working together with a friend or a colleague changes your dynamic, specifically if you're touring the world and this much money and investment is involved. And I'm also sure there's probably some power play there with Tana being the bigger person and Brooke not being the bigger person and being given a platform by Tana. All of these dynamics come into it. Now, there were very awkward moments on stage, and I think that them going on tour ultimately, again, showed that they were prioritizing making quick money as fast as possible with this podcast rather than wanting to do it in the long run, which ultimately, of course, it fucking ended. So whenever Brooke comes back to the podcast after, all of this has happened, it was over. It was over. Brooke looked visibly irritated on the podcast, as much as she would say that she wasn't. Tana was taking more control of the podcast than ever before. Brooke would sit in silence. There was awkward silences that would go on for long. It was like now forced chemistry. Like, their dynamics seemed forever impacted by the Brooke scandal. Brooke no longer wanted to give opinions on things, no longer would talk about her personal life, no longer would overshare, and she would actively, be saying like, I don't want this to be taken out of context. I don't want to piss people off with this. And so a podcast that was built on oversharing and not caring, now when you're showing, I'm not going to give you anything, the podcast was done. It was done. And they were actively also saying during this time that they just wanted to end the podcast, but they had to keep it going with their contract. I can't believe people were still watching it. It's like watching people being held hostage to be friends. The fights and bickering were so fucking much on the podcast, and it was just very uncomfortable to watch. I don't think the tour helped. Brooke's cancellation obviously was the end of the podcast. How Tana handled it was obviously the end of the podcast. How Brooke handled it was also the end of it. And I also don't think ultimately either of them really cared about each other in the long run to keep something going for as long. Kind of like, Trisha and Ethan. They really didn't care about each other enough to, maintain a relationship, just kind of get quick money on a podcast. And the show, I think, in the end was literally just kind of like running on fumes, I would say. No, there's another couple points I want to make, right? I do think that, yes, Brooke Schofield's racism was a huge turning point for the ending of the podcast. But I also do believe that another big element of the podcast ending, there's two more in my opinion. The second last one is Tana Mongeau's obsession with Trisha Paytas. Tana Mongeau has a deep obsession with Trisha Paytas. It's very, very, very clear, okay? And the last reason that I believe the podcast ended was sobriety and the fact that they're both in relationships. I also think the fact that Brooke's, fiance has allegations against him also didn't help in the fucking long run. But anyways, let's do sobriety and then let's do Trisha, okay? So the podcast started with them both being drunk messes and hooking up with all of LA. And to cut a long story short, by the ending of the podcast, Tana was sober, spending most of her time in Hawaii with her new long-term relationship, and Brooke Schofield was engaged. Completely different. And they didn't even go out anymore. Like they didn't hang out at the clubs anymore because they weren't going to the clubs. So everything that made the podcast was no longer there. And yes, it was great to see, a journey, of growth, specifically with Tana going from, like no shade, a drunken mess to look at that, this new era, good for her. That was great. But ultimately, if we're speaking professionally, the podcast was ruined once those decisions were made. And that's okay, because you shouldn't have to keep doing a work thing if it means you have to be a drunken mess when it's obviously not working out well for you. However, when Tana Mongeau embraced this new sobriety era, and it seems to be going very well for her, and she looks great, and she seems to be doing great, and good for her. I'm always rooting for, if that is the right thing for you, then go for it, and I will support you. I think one thing to note is that when Trisha Paytas kind of, post Colleen Ballinger scandal started to like reinvent her career in a way of like focusing on the branding and focusing on the fact that she was a mommy now and, she's not getting into drama anymore and she's doing Just Trish, but she's not involved in the drama. She's covering it. It was clear to me that from that moment, Tana Mongeau didn't want to do the Cancel podcast in the way that they were doing it anymore and wanted to be Trisha Paytas and how she rebranded. I think that Tana is very clearly obsessed with Trisha. I think she's very clearly fixated on Trisha's rebrand. She brings it up so fucking much. Trisha went from chaotic drama to, this like soft image. And that's exactly what Tana keeps telling us that she wants to have. The internet loved when Trisha did it, but with Tana, it just feels very forced in my opinion. And it's like she's actively studying how to be like Trisha Paytas, and she wanted this rebrand for herself. And, it's working for her, which is great. But ultimately, the fact that she was doing this and then sitting down in the podcast with Brooke, where they're supposed to be oversharing and messy, well, that doesn't work out with the branding. And then what? Is Brooke going to be carrying the podcast by being the only one who's being open and honest and you're not? Of course Brooke would pull back. And of course Tana would pull back. So then we just have two women literally being held hostage to talk to each other. I think that the Trisha Not Loveline podcast was, again, the final nail in the coffin for the Cancel podcast. And I also think it was a big fuck you to Brooke, if I'm being honest. Tana's obsession with Trisha is one thing, but then creating a Not Loveline podcast with Trisha in the midst of the Cancel podcast where you're spending more time and effort on was a huge fuck you to Brooke. And I honestly, just from a friendship standpoint, see it as like a really negative, nasty thing that she did. I think it was a big fuck you. And I think it's very clear that Brooke depends on Tana financially more than the other way. However, Tana signed contracts and got into agreements. And I think that doing the podcast with Trisha was a big way of kind of letting Brooke know her place. And whatever your opinion of Brooke or whatever your opinion of Tana or Trisha is, it's just slimy to me. It really is. It's like almost like homie hopping to whoever's going to give you the most social clout. I don't think Cancelled was, destroyed by like one thing in particular. I think it was this combination of things. It was, them evolving. At the end of the day, they weren't these people anymore, and that's okay. But I think that they both started to spite each other after the Brooke cancellation. I think that was the turning point where, Tana now wants to be with Trisha and Brooke no longer wants to overshare. And from that moment on, it was done. I think that the podcast, again, shows this. You go through eras. You're friends with people for a season. That can be a thing as well. However, I do think that by the end of it, both of them were sabotaging each other in the long run. Now, let me know your opinion of this down below. I would love to hear your thoughts and we can talk about it. And yeah, I'll see you in my next one and goodbye.